City Council. Purpose of tonight's meeting is to continue our review of the budget with the City Council. And one thing I wanted to point out to you that I didn't point out to you previously, in the books that we gave each of you, in the front jacket, there was a memo to the mayor and council from the city manager regarding the Goodyear Fire Employee Group Budget Recommendation Summary. That is a requirement of our ordinances that they put in their requests in the budget process. The city manager addresses all of those and is to provide you with a list of what was requested and how that was dealt with in the budget process. And for the record, I wanted to make sure that you knew you had that, as well as that that it was noted in the minutes that that has been provided to you in the budget process. This is the third work session that we've had in the last month to review the budget. As you recall, we started this process really in September as we looked at where we were with the prior year budget, with the state shared revenues, opportunities for changes as we're going into the new fiscal year, as well as opportunities as we go forward. We also discussed in the council advance the funding for the various CIP items and council updates on projects and how that funding was taking place. We've had a couple of work sessions that have kind of shown how the model fits together, and tonight is the next in that process to review what the staff proposed budget is, how we got there, what the basis of it was, and to make sure that we're getting you the information that you need. As we go forward, we have one more session scheduled. That is a 1-hour session prior to the May 14th regular council meeting. If the council feels they need more dialogue on the budget, we need to schedule additional meetings to do that. May 29th is scheduled for the adoption of the tentative budget. That same evening, in a work session, the capital improvement plan specifics will be reviewed again. Ken Kennedy and Jim Nichols will be reviewing the capital improvement plan in detail that night. June 25th, we've scheduled for the final adoption of the budget, and that's also scheduled for the final approval of the capital improvement plan. And July 9th is adoption of the property tax levy, the final step in the 2007-2008 budget process. So for tonight's session, our goals are to provide you with additional information regarding the proposed budget, but even more so to answer questions that you may have about the budget process. We really want this to be as informal a discussion as we can. Please ask questions as we go along. This session is scheduled for 2 hours. If it's a presentation and we're done, we can be out of here in about 20 minutes because my presentation is relatively brief. It is more about creating dialogue, getting input from you, answering your questions. Several of you have asked me questions before the meeting, very good questions that you've asked. Please don't be afraid to ask questions as we go through there. If we do not have the answer tonight, we'll follow up with the answer at a future work session. But it's to give you as much background as we possibly can in the budget as we're going forward. Yes?
Some of the questions that we've already asked, would you just address those when the time is right?
Okay.
We won't ask them again, but will you address those?
And yeah, because senility is one of my biggest assets, I'm going to start with a question I was asked. I'll do that right now because I'm not going to get into specifics of positions tonight. I was asked a question that relates to the, no, I'm not going to in my presentation. That doesn't mean your questions cannot. That can be all night of the discussion if you prefer. The one question I was asked by Councilman Sousa was on the buyer position, do we not have one already? And the short answer is yes, this would be a second one. A little longer answer, and this is within the finance department. The way our system works, we have to go with positions that are in the system at the time. This is our budget system I'm referring to, and the budget database. We go with the positions that are in there at the time, but we are actually asking that the existing position be renamed procurement specialist, and the position we're requesting would be a second procurement specialist, and they would be focusing specifically on our RFPs and the contracts and trying to make sure that that process runs more efficiently than it is today. So that was one of the questions that I was asked earlier. The other two are more recent, and so my short-term...
The two positions for mayor and council.
Yes, very good. I will, let's see here. That is a very, yes, in the chart on the books, it shows in your presentation, I'll get you an exact page on that. Page 37, it's in the tab for personnel. The top line shows mayor and council with 2 positions for this upcoming year. It also shows manager's office with 19 positions. As you know, there's a third position that's been added in this upcoming year. That position is reflected, for budget purposes, is reflected in the city manager's office. One of the things that we talked about, and in case I forget, but I think we'll bring it up later in this session, that we talked about, it links very closely with the matrix assessment and with a number of questions that have come up at a staff review of the budget, is to, we're going to do a more analysis of the positions, where we have them, and see if that's linking with where they should be. And some of that becomes part of the matrix assessment, which, as I understand it, and this came to me about a half hour ago, but as I understand it, there's some discussion in there that maybe certain functions should move to other functional areas. Do we move the budgets with them? Do we move those authorized positions? How does that help you or hinder you in your analysis as we go forward? If we don't discuss that further later, please let me know on that.
And one of the other questions was, we were interested in the special position that we had talked about at a city council meeting about the kind of an overseer for the Bullard.
Oh, yes. On the information council follow-up forms that are not part of the budget materials but are part of the information that is sent out to you weekly by the city manager, there is a follow-up item that staff has, which is from a council meeting discussing the Bullard corridor improvements, and the question asked was, do we have one person, we may need one person that their job is to kind of coordinate all of this is coming together. Is that reflected in the budget? The answer is no. That issue has not evolved adequately enough for it to be included in the position. But that also we'll talk about in one of my items as we talk about the city manager budget, and a follow-up to some of your other questions later in the session.
You want us to hold questions until you go through?
I can go through, but I really encourage your questions as I am going through.
Okay.
And so maybe what I'll try to do is, if I've got it on the slides, I'll say, okay, we will get to that. If I don't have it on the slides, let's make sure we get your question answered as we're going whenever it comes up to you. Because that's the important part of the dialogue. It's to indicate we're really trying to keep this as informal as possible. With that, I want to start with a discussion and a brief explanation of a relatively complex spreadsheet, and that is on page 17. It is referred to as the sources and uses. What the sources and uses spreadsheet is intended to accomplish is to communicate the total balancing of the budget, how all of the funds flow through the budget, and what balances are left after we apply all of those resources. If you'll notice on page 17, does everyone have a copy either of the handout or of the budget book, or we've got extra copies that we brought for any that may have forgotten? Okay. Just kind of an overview of it. Going across in the columns across, that lists the various funds, and they're summarized. We actually have considerably more funds than what are reflected in there, but each fund is a separate group of accounts, and balancing lists the major groups and categories of funds as we go through. The very top half of the sources and uses deals with what we refer to often as the operating budget. You see operating revenues, and the top lines, the top 4 lines, refer to operating revenues. Those are simply those revenues that we allocate that we say are available for operations.
Larry, is that on Elmo?
It can be if we turn that on. I've got mine open to it here. Yeah. Well, if I can zoom up, I
Turn
can
your
kind of
page.
slide the page around to make it work here. Dial this in closer here. I'm just showing the top left-hand corner as we go through this. So the revenues, the operating revenues are reflected on the top left-hand corner, and then we apply it as we go across to the various funds. The operating expenditures then show what we're applying against those operating revenues. Those are the direct expenditures out of each source of fund. The general fund is the one you hear the most about, and it's the one that it's a good way to get a budget person or an accountant going is saying, oh, does that money go in the general fund? How horrible. So I remind everyone, yeah, that's the fund that pays your salary, because that is the chief operating fund for the city of Goodyear, or for any government for that matter. We do have other funds to account for very specific enterprise-type activities such as water, sewer, sanitation. The general fund also at times needs to supplement the activities of other funds. You'll notice in there $2.2 million going over to the highway user fund, which basically covers the street department costs as well as the public transportation costs. The revenues we collect on state shared revenues are inadequate to cover those costs at a reasonable level. By the way, the definition of operating is those recurring type costs that you expect every year, as opposed to when we get to the bottom half of the schedule, it talks about one-time both revenue sources and expenditure sources. And the one-time revenue sources that we're showing in there, the construction sales tax is really what that capital revenues item of the $22 million represents. The $14 million, I've got a bad copy on here that should say Newland. Cotton Lane Bridge revenue, that's the $14 million from the development agreement. That's where we're showing that money coming in. So, and then the beginning fund balance, and I'll go over that a little bit later in this presentation. And then the capital expenditures refer to one-time expenditures. Some are the capital improvement plan. We do show the contingency, the reserve, the $20 million. We show that as part of this. We also show a number of the other expenditures, one time for equipment replacement, and some of those costs get reflected in here. Excuse me. As you work down, then, you get a net from capital. In this case, it's zero as we're presenting because we've applied both the operating and the capital resources, creating a fund balance, meaning all of the resources that we have are allocated at this point in time. We could go back to the presentation, please. As we go forward in the budget process, we do expect a few changes that will come through on the sources and uses and on the total budget. Some of those changes are carryover of CIP projects. At this point in time, we have assumed that everything in the 06-07 CIP is done as of June 30th of this year. As an example, all of us know that Van Buren will not be done. Wish, but it will not be done as of that point in time. For next year's budget, we need to take the money that is set aside in the 06-07 budget and carry it over to 07-08. We are doing that in one step. We're going to do that, I hope, by the May 14th meeting. I believe we can have that together, that we can have that number added in by that time. That'll increase the budget, but it makes it legally available for us to spend. I haven't worried about adding it in sooner because we already programmed those dollars. Through the CIP process in May 29th in the work session, City Council will have the opportunity to review the status of those projects. If you want to change anything in that, you can do that through the CIP process, not really in the budget process at that point in time. So our role in that is going to be more tracking the funds and making sure that we have the authority to spend that money.
And in the 07-08 budget, okay, we will show that as a separate entity joining the amount that we've allocated for the Van Buren project?
Yes. Well, actually, let me correct that. Because we're doing this before June 30th, we still have to make estimates. So what we're going to do in the process is we're going to show that as one line item in the budget department. And the reason is then when July 1st rolls around, we will be able to track what we really did spend so that we only pull the money over to the extent we didn't spend it in actual as opposed to estimate. That'll reduce the risk of double spending the same dollars. So that's my qualification to what you suggested, but yes, it will be by project, not in bulk. And it is not. It is new cash that'll come in from the funding source and new expenditures that come in, but it's all applied in the same fashion. Okay? When I say CIP balance to available funds, in the sources and uses, as we show capital improvement plan expenditures, right now we're showing that all of them will be spent for next year. As an example, we have certain money in the library impact fee fund that will not be spent by June 30th of 2008. As the final CIP is rolled out, we will adjust those numbers downward to reflect that cash carried over so that that remains there. The reason it won't be spent in that time frame is we won't have enough money to complete the project, so there will be money because you don't build half of a library or something to that effect. And then we've got a few of the what I call small capital developer contributions that are not funded in here, that are not reflected. Most of those, I believe, involve the Sonoran Valley annexation for certain equipment that they've agreed to acquire that I don't think we've got in this side of the budget. Okay?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
But that's one of the questions that I was going to pose to you. That in the listing of new and replacement equipment for fiscal year 07-08, you do show several items under the fire department, i.e. the vehicle fire truck, vehicle incident command, vehicle PD, SUV, computers, communication equipment. How much of that is going to be reimbursable by the developer? Or you
Okay,
just
on page 20.
Page 20.
Okay, on page 20, if you notice in the department name column, it says Sonoran Valley Project.
Right.
All of those are subject to reimbursement from the developer and will be reimbursed 100%.
Then let me ask you this question. Why is it then being shown in the 07-08 budget as our money?
As our money?
Yeah.
Because we will be the ones that will be procuring it. We will go through our processes to acquire it and bill them for it, and they will reimburse us. And that is to meet the flow of funds concept required under governmental accounting standards. But it'll show as a revenue and as an expenditure.
You know, I think it might be wise for us to show an indication that that money that I've just identified is reimbursable by the developer, so that the press doesn't pick this up or the resident doesn't pick this up because of what we've been going through in the past week and a half.
Okay, I think that's a valid point. Our attempt at doing that was labeling it as the Sonoran Valley annexation, which everything is,
But you're
but
showing-
maybe we should add the words reimbursable just for clarification in that.
Because you are showing it in our budget.
Yes, absolutely.
Along those same lines, would you show an expense sheet as well for the Sonoran Valley revenue? Just as you're showing it as revenue, I would assume you would. Good point. It's along the same lines as what Dick is mentioning here. You might note in the budget that it's reimbursable, but next year at the end of the year.
Yes.
You're in static. Okay. But next year at the end of the year, you'd show $2.5 million in revenue, but then you'd show what we expensed against that $2.5 million in revenue.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay, what we're going to be doing in the whole Sonoran Valley annexation accounting process, we have created a sub-fund in our books where we are going to be tracking all transactions from that entity or from that area separately, direct transactions.
Such that if you got a phone call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 5 o'clock had to produce a sheet, you could do it?
Such as, well, except for, my staff could do it if they were all there.
Right.
I'll qualify at that level, but yes. Yes, that we could be able to print it out at any point in time. It may not reflect a current billing at that point in time because we're getting reimbursed. So there may be a time lag between the expenditure and when we got the cash.
But I mean, yeah.
But something that we can fully reconcile at any point in time, that's correct. It'll have all of these charged to it, the direct costs. Okay? It'll then also, within there, we will have the revenues charged. The reason for that is exactly what you're referring to make sure that we can track that those costs are being reimbursed as they're intended to be. That we can track it, we can show it to you, we can show it to ourselves, we can show it to the developer, we can show it to anyone who's asking that those are being tracked that way. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
I got to ask this question. I've never gotten this deep into it, but do our people have to, in community development, for instance, when they put in their timesheet, have to hourly account for what project they're working on?
In the community development side,
Or, I mean, in the sense of Sonoran Valley. I mean,
community development in Sonoran Valley, they are paying building permits. And so we are not tracking community development as an extra cost in the Sonoran Valley direct cost. They are paying the building permits which cover those services. Where it applies is fire, where they are hiring, or we are hiring, I believe it's 9 total positions in the fire department. And in the police department, we're hiring a half a lieutenant. The other half will be in there. Now that one, what we've already agreed with the developer is we're going to probably just charge them for half of the annual cost and not have a detailed timesheet. In the fire department, we've talked a couple of different mechanics of it. If there are people that are assigned to it and that's their only assignment, it gets easy. If it's the other way, we'll be able to track it through what we call project numbers in our accounting system.
You do great.
Was there not an hourly charge in the development agreement with them for certain sets of tasks?
Actual cost.
It was actual cost. So it wasn't an hourly, there was no hourly rates.
So there's an
For some
actual
reason I
cost.
thought I saw hourly rates.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Council, there's no hourly rates that I recall.
Okay.
But there is the actual cost, and there's a 25% surcharge to try to capture the other.
That was the thing that's triggering that question in my head, is how are we going to
The
capture?
administrative, we figure it'd be difficult to
25%.
track that, so we built a model where we're going to capture 25% for those other administrative departments' time incurred.
So how are you coming to the conclusion of the time incurred, is what I'm...
Well, we're not going to, I think we realized it'd be very difficult to track that. So we built a 25% surcharge on top of the costs incurred to try to capture those costs.
So if they pay $1 for a permit, they're going to pay $1.25.
No,
Got it.
no, not for a permit they are.
Well, or I mean
For
for...
an example.
If they pay for when they reimburse us for the fire positions, they're going to pay $1.25 to the dollar.
Such as the admin person is paid for and the HR person is paid for.
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly. Okay?
That was the thought that triggered that question, so.
Now, linked to the sources and uses, I excerpted a few rows and columns from the sources and uses that you have. This chart represents just a listing of the various revenues within the budget, with the top part being the operating revenues, and then the capital revenues, which on your actual sources and uses are halfway down. And the first three columns that I did in there, general fund, grants, and highway user fund, because those are three of the significant operating funds. But you'll notice the total column comes from your sources and uses and includes all of the funds. I do not intend this worksheet that I'm presenting to you to cross foot. If you notice on there, the top line, operating revenues in the general fund and PERF combined for about 68 million, but that total says 89 million. That's because other funds that are included, and just to show these numbers consistent. But I'm not going to talk much about the revenues tonight unless there are questions. We went through that last week. Joe did a presentation, showed where we were on the revenue estimates, where we expected to be at the end of the year, where we expect to be in this upcoming year. But this was to kind of show you a little more of how we use the sources and uses. Fund balance gets to be one of the most difficult areas to explain as we go through the process, especially when we add the carryover funds to it, as we will in a few weeks. But the beginning fund balance, as shown, and I'm doing the general fund, grants, and the highway user fund, because the general fund is the one that will keep up any other funds that'll do the support. So I'm showing the fund balance for those three funds combined in this schedule. Those are the key numbers. And those we're estimating at June 30th of this year to be $39.1 million. Keep in mind, again, that assumes that all of our projects will be complete as of June 30th of this upcoming year. All of our capital projects. In other words, capital projects out of the general fund may indeed be higher if that hasn't come through our books yet. So what are the components that make up that $39 million? What is that money? As you recall, when we did the audit presentation, the general fund had about $7 million. Total citywide had a different number. It was a little lower, but about $7 million of general fund from June 30th of 2006 above our estimates for that point in time. Keep in mind, we estimate our cash balances in about March of each year. And the estimates in this year were actually done in early April, or updated then. At the end of last year also, there was about $4.8 million that in general fund that was unallocated at the end of the year. And so we expected to have that $4.8 million. As Joe talked to you about last week, Joe Pizzillo in his revenue presentation, there's about $13.6 million of revenues above what we expected this year, some of which came from the construction sales tax that came in considerably higher than what we estimated. Funded depreciation is where we set aside money for replacement equipment, and it is a set aside as a reserve and therefore is not spent, and so therefore we did not expect to spend that during the year. That's $3.3 million. Throughout these budgets, meaning the Streets Department and the general fund budgets, our savings over the budget for personnel costs were about $2.2 million. Our budget policies, for example, we budget our personnel costs assuming that all positions are hired as of July 1st and maintained throughout the year regardless. In other words, zero turnover plus all positions filled immediately on July 1st. Obviously, that is an impossible scenario to keep, so that builds a little conservatism into that. That represents, if I remember right, about 5% of the personnel budgets for those departments. The professional and contract services categories, there's a savings of about $1.1 million. Materials and supplies, we're estimating about $500,000 savings. one-time projects that are non-capital, but still one-time in nature. We're expecting we will not spend about $700,000 that was identified for that. An additional $1.8 million of carryover that are one-time or small capital. A large component of that carryover, $700,000, represents some equipment in the streets department that has not been received as of this point in time and therefore is not shown as being spent. In fact, that's a carryover, but it's similar to what I talked about in the capital improvement plan, but for these, we roll that money in right here in this process. Special project savings represent the monies that we set aside in last year's budget, both for state shared revenues and the revolving fund, and not all of those monies got allocated in the budget process, and so there's $6.9 million that we're expecting available as of June 30th of this year that can roll into next year's budget.
At I-10.
That includes the mechanisms to fund I-10. That includes the funding also for the stadium. As you recall, when we set that funding up, we started with the 2006-2007 budget. We allocated about $2.5 million towards those projects, knowing we would only spend about $100,000 of it. And that $100,000 went to the I-10 widening. But we wanted to build the account up so that by 2010, when we hit the peak for the I-10 costs, that money is all set aside and it's not as big of an impact in that 1 year. So that $2.4 million that's a part of this 6.9 represents those monies that we intended to carry over for future projects. The remaining money we talked about, there was a discussion of whether or not the state shared revenues, for example, came in higher than our original estimate. Should those be used for personnel or should those be used for capital? And in the council discussions at the advance in November, there was a discussion at that time that we needed as much money as we could apply towards capital and that those monies should be stored so that we could use those towards capital purchases or purposes as we go forward. The non-spent reserve, $13.5 million, that was actually in the budget at $15 million. We came back to you during the year with the Finita project that needed additional funding of $1.5 million, and that was subtracted out of there. That could just as easily have been subtracted out of the state shared revenues, but this is where we chose to do it when that funding was done. The final item then is the Cotton Lane Bridge. And in this year's budget, we have in 2006-2007, we're programming $17 million in excess of what we originally budgeted to come out in the Cotton Lane Bridge. Original budget was $7 million. What we're saying with this is we're expecting our total costs for 2006-2007 to be $24 million. But $7 million we already had programmed. This $17 million, to compare as we did the overall analysis on the Cotton Lane Bridge was that the Sunterra Development Group, the King Ranch property, would reimburse the city when that property developed a total of $21 million. $17 million of it is reflected in this number. The remaining $4 million is reflected in the capital improvement plan for 2007-2008. Any questions on the fund balance? I know when I start talking about this, I get people scratching their heads considerably. So,
Did our eyes glaze over? Is that what you're saying?
I had a lot of people looking like, ooh, here we go. Larry's talking numbers again. Otherwise, we can come back to any questions as it may arise as we're going on to other issues and how they're funded. I want to talk a little bit about operating expenditures because it's a term that we use quite a bit, and what does it mean? Primarily what operating expenditures are those expenditures that we expect to recur from year to year. The way we put our budget together, we start with what we call a base budget, which would represent the personnel costs, the materials and supplies, professional and contractual services for our various departments from the previous year. There's an assumption that those needs would remain the same as we go forward. And so that's what we call our base budget. And for round numbers for the whole city for this year, that base budget was about $70 million for 2006, 2007. And that is on the sources and uses, the top three lines of the operating expenditures. What that does not include that's on the operating expenditures categories are debt service, the revolving fund, which we included up in the operating category for this year's presentation, and it does not include the developer reimbursements for sales tax in that discussion. And I tell you that because as we go through, sometimes we use different terms or use the same term to mean different things in the budget process. And as I go forward, that's something we're trying to change, but that change has to evolve over a period of time because the terminology is very critical from one year to the next, from one person to the next, and so forth. And so they're really, I've just outlined for you a second definition that includes a broader definition of operating expenditures, but all of those are handled individually on an annual basis. The specific supplemental requests are shown on pages 22 through 34 of your book, with a very brief description, sometimes admittingly inadequate description, as well as the dollar amounts. This year is different from what we've done in the past years, and that is that this year we went through a process meeting with the city council goals where we talked about that we needed to hold down the growth of our operating budget so that we had more money available for both debt service and capital projects going forward. So we went through a process with the staff that said that to limit your first level communications to your deputy city manager or the city manager to 10% of your existing budget right off from the start. Now that wasn't an entitlement, that was kind of a cap on what you could ask for at that level. And then from there, those were reviewed and determined what was going to go forward based on what funds were available and so forth. So each of the supplemental requests this year required pre-approval before they were submitted. In other words, the supplemental requests, as you're seeing them, are really a communication between the departments and the budget office of what changes were happening in the budget this year. But for you, they're a good tool to tell you what is being funded in this year's budget from an operating standpoint or a one-time capital standpoint that wasn't funded in prior years. So that was kind of the whole purpose of why we included that in the books. And as you're looking through that, or if you have specific questions, that's where we hope we can answer those questions on them.
I don't understand the 10% you mentioned.
Okay.
The change between last year and this year is substantially higher than that.
The change between last year and this year is higher. The 10% was a cap that we put on. But what that didn't include at that point, because the departments do not control this in the process, was the increases that take place in personnel costs, whether it's the adjustments to the ranges, merit increases, those types of costs. Those are built into the model and not included in there. And so as we get a few pages on in this presentation, let me go to that now. Unfortunately, it's not, it's a little hard to read up on the screen, but this is about 2 pages on in the handout that I gave you this evening, where we're showing that the total increases averaged 17.4% for all departments from last year to this year. Included in those numbers, in that 17.4%, did include $6.4 million for the revolving fund. In this year's number, none of last year's $2.5 million was included in that $72 million. So that's an item we reduced. And the second is the Sonoran Valley annexation included up above in those numbers is approximately $2 million. So that nets out to about 13.4%. This then shows the various categories and departments and how those changes affected for each of those departments. Not all of these are necessarily personnel costs or so forth. Look at a couple of them very specifically that jump out. Fire and emergency services, and I'm going to do it in this order intentionally. Fire and emergency services includes 9 positions for personnel down in the Sonoran Valley area. That would, for round numbers, be probably in the area of $800,000 or $900,000 in that budget, just in that line item. Actually, no, it's probably more than that by the time the other costs are calculated. Those are specific positions, and those did get included in the specific departments. However, community development increased by 56%. All costs that are not personnel related, and these costs are listed, I know we have these in a previous presentation. I'll see if I can find these in the book. But all costs that are not listed there, and those total about a million, it wouldn't be the whole $1.9 million, I don't think. It would be about $1 million of that are actually shown in the Community Development Department. And so that explains part of that increase in that particular department. But we gave this as a tool to kind of show where the changes were taking place. As I mentioned in the city manager's office from a previous question, we included the funding for the intergovernmental position that was included in there. That is in this year's budget that wasn't in the past. For one council staff person, the council assistant position got included in this department. Probably should have been included in mayor and council, but it's here, is where it is. Also, a project manager position that we added mid-year is included in this, and that's some of the reasons that that one increased. The public works categories increased. If you notice in the parks, they had 2 things hit them. Had a large increase in some of the electrical costs, and the first-year operating costs for the stadium are reflected in the parks category of the public works side. The building services are included to reflect additional lease costs, for facilities. For the public works and water and wastewater, I combined all of those departments to give you kind of a total percentage crossing the departments. Sometimes those lines get a little blurry, so I wanted just to show a total for all of those types of percentages. Be happy to ask any other specific questions on this or answer any that I can on this, and if I can't, I will definitely get you a response at a future presentation.
You had a reduction in economic development.
Oh, good. Thank you. Good question. That reduction is a reduction in the retail sales tax reimbursements due to payoffs of previous retail sales tax reimbursements from last year to this year. Some of those are being paid off. I believe Lowe's is either paid off or about paid off. Target is, I believe, paid off. The new ones for retail that we've agreed to are generally a year away before that retail will be coming in. So this is a 1-year reduction in those amounts of payments, and that causes a reduction in that department. Good question.
But here again, if Target and Lowe's is coming off, that should show an increase then for sales tax coming to the city, because we were on a 50-50 basis with them.
Okay, good question. As we talked about the last meeting, for accounting standards, we show the revenues grossed up. We have to show the dollar of revenue and the 50 cents as an expenditure. So when we showed that 50 cents as an expenditure, we charged that to the economic development line item. So the dollar will continue going in, but the expense went away.
And you're showing that in economic development?
That's where we showed the dollar last year, or the 50 cents, excuse me. We showed the 50 cents last year. Some of them went away, and so that'll show a reduction. A year from now, when we have this conversation, we're going to be showing a larger dollar amount going in there.
Okay, right. Gotcha. Okay.
Okay?
So how, if the public says on a development agreement that you're generating X amount of dollars and we're expensing that reimbursable through economic development, how are we able to say, or where do you show that we're covering that 50 cent reimbursable part? In essence, you're bringing the taxes in.
As a revenue.
Let's use the future, for example. Vestar, we owe them $4.4 million in the future based on tax revenue for their specific lifestyle center, or whatever that development agreement called for. How are we ensuring that we're covering the costs that we're reimbursing them? You're doing some accounting somewhere that's showing
Okay.
a dollar of tax coming from that specific property.
Yes, we are tracking each of those. The contract administrator actually is the person that tracks those agreements, gets the sales tax information, and tracks it and makes sure that we get the paperwork processed and pay them. What we're showing then is that for each agreement, we have a ledger for each agreement that we keep.
Right.
That shows, okay, here is the status of this particular agreement. Total dollars to be reimbursed were $1 million. Quarter one, we reimbursed $100,000. We still owe $900,000 under the agreement. Here, and the $100,000 came from sales tax of $200,000. So we're tracking that individually. Collectively, the actual payment goes into the economic development line item for the 50 cents, and then the full dollar of revenue goes into the revenue category. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, as long as obviously there's proprietary information involved there, because then somebody can back into their sales and figure out what their sales are, and that's our development agreements call for confidentiality in that. But if looked under a microscope, you can show that we're not reimbursing a dollar when we've only collected a dollar. It sounds like you are. In the
Yes,
ledgers that you're
absolutely.
talking about.
Absolutely. We are monitoring all of these agreements to make sure that we are reimbursing under the terms of the agreement.
And if we track all of this, on all of these agreements, then we have a fairly good source of information when new development comes in, and incentives, what works and what doesn't work, and what was paid out, too much paid out. You know what I'm saying? Our development agreement, our agreements. So we do have a track record. Example, I said when we opened during Westcorp, okay, do we have any information from other developers other cities that had a Westcorp opening and what the incentives they gave? We talked about that. Okay, so now if we track this on all of our commercial developments, we have some history to go back to look over. Is that correct? And be able to use that information?
We have history that we can use from an analytical perspective of showing what we've paid out in total dollars.
And what we
in those
gained by
agreements. And what we've gained would come from the agreements also.
Well, I think that we
You
ought to
work
do that. I
backwards.
think that we ought to have that type of tracking of performance on every development and shopping center we open up, so that when someone new comes in, we have some basis in what to look at, rather than just sit down at a table and arbitrarily listen to figures and numbers. It's just, it gives us history.
I think the Chevron bill mandated that, didn't it? That we have to, when we're given an incentive, we have to demonstrate that it's,
It's pre-incentive.
but then I think it has to continue.
Do an economic analysis by a third party that's not retained by the developer prior to the retail sales incentive, yes.
Prior to, but what happens, do we go back and that's what you're getting at, Jim?
Yeah,
You said
I
his
think
bill
it's-
called for that.
Yeah, I think it's both, but I know it's before, and I think it's during, but I may be wrong on that.
And do in fact reuse that information. Just,
It would be interesting to be able to look at, one of the first ones that I remember taking action on was the Pioneer Ford deal that we did and seeing how that performed. And obviously we can't, because of proprietary information, because of confidentiality, you can't get into that in a public setting necessarily. But it would be interesting knowledge to have for those of us on the dais making decisions as it relates to future development agreements. So if there are ways to explain that to us, whether it's executive session type of material or not, it sure sounds like, you guys are you're understanding the full picture.
yeah, but I would assume
these
staff
development
would use
agreements
that.
beforehand, but we never really
I would assume staff would be using
the
some of that
end game.
information. And
and how it worked out.
Larry, why is that proprietary?
The sales tax information that we receive on any individual business is very confidential. In fact, I don't even get it myself. We cannot release that for any business in our community. So we have a number of different mechanisms. Roy can talk to you about some of them, but as we deal with these development agreements, we have to have wording that protects their confidentiality, protects our staff, quite frankly, because our staff that does read these could be subject to legal action if they were to release it. And so as we go through, there are various ways. Sometimes a developer will report information to us, and we just go in and verify whether it's reasonable. Other cases, we're just telling the developer, we're going to pay you a flat amount, and you're going to have to trust us.
Who makes that judgment? They do?
It's, as we're negotiating the agreement, it's all part of it, but legal counsel is one.
Yeah, it's difficult to craft that specific provision because state law does make all of that information confidential. So the negotiation point with the developers, we start with, you're going to have to trust us. And a lot of times they don't necessarily want to trust us. So you start dealing with, you pay for third-party audits if they don't agree with what our figures are in any particular year. I often encourage the developer, where you are in control of this commercial development, you need to enter into agreements with your individual lessees that's going to report those figures to you, and then you can provide those to us, and like Larry said, we can verify if you're not going to trust us on what the figures are. So state law does make all of those sales tax reporting numbers confidential, so that's always the tension we have in the reimbursement agreements.
Does that prohibit us from then? Does that prohibit us from then looking at these in a performance basis post?
We can do an economic analysis.
general.
We do an economic
more
analysis.
general, but I don't know if it's going to drill down that deep, because I don't know that we can provide our economists those figures necessarily. And as you as a council, I've actually never thought about whether or not I can.
Everybody's
go to
always
the executive session and provide those figures to you. I'll have to take a look at
Inherently,
that.
we're just trusting the system, but the public is a skeptic to begin with. And so, if we're just trusting the system, and we never look back to figure out if these things work, I think inherently we believe they work, we know they work. But that's probably the argument that's going on that you often face, Mayor, down at the legislature, is are they really working, and how do you prove they're working?
One possible,
It's advantageous for us to learn how we prove they work.
well, maybe one possible analytical tool that we could look at is if we could give you a history that says, okay, of the existing development agreements that we've had, the average payout is 2.5 years or 3.6 or something to that effect. I don't know. That might be something that would be a tool for you. And I don't know the answer. Please don't use either of those as a.
Or were there any that were supposed to, had a horizon of 5 years and they never reached the maximum mark? That would say to me that maybe that development didn't necessarily perform to the expectations that we thought it would.
We can
do
I'll work
that
with legal
analysis, I
counsel
think.
and do see what we can do with
Yeah.
some broad analysis.
Thank you, Matt. Good idea. Good question.
Okay. As we talked earlier, a lot of this is intended to be interactive, receiving as much information, or providing you with as much as we can, but make sure we're focusing on your questions. I wanted to make sure we followed up on some things from prior meetings that have been asked, either by the City Council or in the very first bullet. There are items that I was going to include and plain did not in my presentation, or I may have misrepresented something unintentionally. Very first, in the personnel costs included as a project the personnel costs themselves is not, but included as a specific budget item. When I talked about personnel costs, we have included $125,000 to do a compensation classification study. Also included in there, and this is included again as a line item in human resources, there is $230,000 to fund the health retirement savings. When the City Council approved that project, it was approved without funding for the very first year, which was 06-07, and the intent was to fund it in 07-08. That is that money coming through. I'll give you those two items because I failed to mention those to you at previous meetings, and I did not want to keep that failure going.
But next year, that would be would that be higher next year? Next budget year?
I do not.
Increase in that?
The comp class study could be higher in operating expenses if it shows that there are additional costs in comparison, yes. The health retirement savings,
We actually anticipate that to be relatively flat for the first 2 or 3 years.
okay. The next item is issue development funding in the city manager's budget. As we talked about last week in the presentation, that as we put the city manager's budget together, we put about $2.4 million in there for issue development in 4 major areas. One was implementation of the matrix study. The second was the MSS study, which is a specific technology study, Third was Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee. And fourth was employment corridor. There was a discussion, city council meeting, of under what authority would that money be spent? Would it come back to the city council? Would it not come back to the city council? Some very good questions. And then that led to a further dialogue on the matrix assessment. I'm going to start with the first of this $2.4 million, and then we'll go to the next slide where I talk about the matrix assessment more specifically. What I'm recommending in the expenditure of the $2.4 million is that the city manager would have authority to spend it up to $75,000 for studies, consulting services, as he deemed appropriate in relation to those objectives. That's very consistent with our purchasing ordinance and the authority that the city manager has. As far as any additional positions that would be funded out of that $2.4 million, those positions would come back to the city council. That would be my recommendation. So could not hire a person without city council approval out of that. I'm going to go to the next one because this okay, go ahead.
May I ask? I think the current limit is 35,000.
You just approved about a month ago the 75,000.
We did.
Oh, I missed that one.
Yeah, we did do that.
Under what condition? What was that under? Was that a special item or was it part of something?
It was, well, it was a
separate item.
Yeah, it was a separate item on the agenda. It wasn't part of another. I think that was a sole item on the agenda, as I recall.
No, we discussed it separately.
And what that is that is the city manager's authority for items that are not in the budget under our existing ordinances, and that's where that number came from here.
And that was on a case-by-case basis, different projects, no greater than 75,000. Anything greater than 75,000 has to come to city council.
That's correct. We had further discussion linked to what I just brought up, but very important discussion, and that is on the matrix personnel recommendations, which as a staff, as directors, we received our copies approximately a week ago, a little over a week ago. We have a week, until a week from today, to respond back our comments on those. But just as an update, after that time, Matrix will assemble those comments, reconcile them however they see fit, report back, I think, to the council committee, if I'm not mistaken, and so forth. So the question became, in this process, what happens when Matrix is recommending a decrease in positions and our budget is recommending or is adding additional positions? How are we going to deal with that situation? What my recommendation is, and I will say mine because I really developed this and just ran it by the city manager and the deputies, but my recommendation was that on the decreases, that while the positions may be authorized, they cannot be filled until we have what I'm going to call a matrix implementation plan, but that basically, the matrix implementation plan is reviewed with the city council. And that basically is to say, okay, as part of the matrix implementation plan, Matrix is recommending this, we concur with this, therefore we won't hire him, or we don't concur with it for these reasons, but it'll be done with the city council, where you still have the control to say, well, we're the ones that, we don't agree, or we do, or whatever.
Okay, this is after we have put in our argument for...
Absolutely. This is until... That's why I'm saying the matrix process has to evolve on its own time frame to resolve this issue. We cannot match that to the budget. So the real question was, if we're recommending an increase in positions in a department, and matrix is saying that department has too many positions, today it's in a draft form, that may stay, that may not stay. We go out and hire the positions and the comment stays, there may be a mismatch. That was a question we talked about last week. So what I'm recommending is, as we go through the matrix process for those that are decreased, we're going to basically link these positions then before they're ever filled to the implementation on that matrix process, but that has to happen after the final report, not after the draft report.
Right, because we may not agree with it.
May or may not agree with those recommendations. Okay. That's correct. Now, I mentioned also where matrix says that either the department is currently right-sized or is increasing, that what we would do is implement the budget, but then analyze specific increases matrix might be recommending to see if they were consistent with the budget or warrant additional consideration. I mentioned that from this standpoint, that the current direction staff was heading on all positions was that we are moving to get those positions within our system at this point in time, get all the paperwork done to get these positions hired, that when the city council approved the budget, we would be able to go forward, and as many of them as possible would be hired in July. Clearly that won't happen on the decreased positions, but for all other positions that would continue on this schedule. That is my proposal that I throw out to you as a dialogue.
I just have one question. Is this the time that we discussed when we look through the number of positions from each department, that we put our opinion in on whether or not we think that department has enough? This is as good a time as any, or if you want me to finish on this and then you go through, I don't care. I'm okay now. I'll let you finish. No, I'll let you finish.
Okay. I think maybe we ought to keep this dialogue first and talk about this part of the process, and then we'll go to the positions.
Could this be part of the process? I'm just curious, when I read the matrix, I'll just give you an example. There's an awful lot of software concern throughout the matrix with the number of departments. An example for the planning, automated permit information systems. Those type of systems that looks like that throughout the city hall departments needs a different system set. Where does that funding come in order to bring them up to date on those systems?
Okay. ignoring the position part.
I'm
Because
talking
just
the
in
system.
hearing,
Just the system.
just in hearing that part, the $2.4 million that I discussed in the city manager's budget is intended to be a tool to allow us to implement something like that during the year as this issue is massaged out through the matrix process. We had another technology study that's been done, all of those types of things. And that's where these guidelines as far as the spending authority would take place and come back to you. Positions, if they're not on this list, would come back to you, or they can't be filled. Okay?
Well, you've got that,
Oh, okay.
you said there were 4, this issue development fund is kind of a new concept this year. You said there were 4 areas
Yes.
that, public safety matrix, the management system survey, or whatever it was.
The Public Safety Citizens Advisory Committee, and then the Employment Corridor were the 4.
Okay. Can we limit that 2.4 million to those specific issues? Are we calling that out when we adopt the budget, that 2.4 million is limited to that, and to addressing those specific 4 areas?
That was actually the intent of that money, was for those 4 areas only. And so I guess I called that an underlying assumption,
Not that
but I
Steve-
didn't spell it out.
Stephen, not that you're going to get some wild idea here, but I mean, I wouldn't want you to come back, 6, 12 months from now and say, gosh, I thought the $75,000 I spent was for that issue development, and it was for, water safety programs, and we kind of went, wait, whoa. Not that that would be a bad expenditure, but I just don't want there to
That
be a
was the
debate.
intent of the funding, so I think, I would say, as we presented, and that yes, that would be the intent there.
If I might add an observation, the matrix process is lagging behind the budget development process. Therefore, we had to take a shot in the dark. That's the 2.4. That's our best guesstimate. None of the departments in this room has seen each other's documents. City Council knows more about what Matrix is saying about everybody than even some of the conversation you're having here. So they don't even know until the comment now that there was suggestions about, other than maybe that specific department, that there was software needs in a specific department that
Yes,
you
several.
identified. We took a guess. It was also based upon the available funds remaining in the pot after we first took care of the commitment to capital projects at the front end, and as we addressed a sense of where we thought the report was going. But so as that information comes forward, the idea that Rob is raising about 2.4 being earmarked for these general areas and are limited to that unless authorized by the council is probably a very good strategy.
Can I further along that thought, Stephen? I haven't even had time to digest the 2.4. I'm almost thinking we ought to ask ourselves right before we adopt the tentative budget whether the 2.4 assumption is correct or not in the sense whether it's enough.
I mean, I was going to say.
I think you may.
it
I
needs to be
think
more.
once we all get done and once you get all your brains together in terms of directors and we start developing an implementation plan, I would hate to look back and come to December and not be able to increase the budget. We've already adopted a budget and not have enough, along the same premise that you're always saying adopt a bigger budget than you can actually use.
Meet requirements for the
But the matrix, I think we ought to be questioning the assumption on specific dollar amounts as it relates to matrix, public safety.
Agreed.
And we ought to just be questioning that every step of this process and saying, is 2.4 enough, or is 1.2, or is 3.6
Right,
appropriate?
Especially
Asking
since
ourselves that question.
Larry just told us that some of the software that we were thinking about purchasing for IT may come out of that same budget.
Yeah.
So, because I thought that would be like either we tried to make it a capital expense or we try to expense it all? I wasn't sure how we were going to do that.
If I could give a budget person perspective to that, we're obviously open to whatever changes we would have, but if we increase that item because it's specific dollars, we would have to take away from something else to keep it in balance. And as we have the budget there, and obviously I haven't seen I've only seen one department, and it's a relatively simple one, I think, in this process. But as we go through this process, that's a lot to chew in 1 year, just being realistic. For example, you mentioned software, those types of needs. I can't imagine you could do every recommendation that could come out of either of the two studies out of software and technology needs in 1 year. You'd have to develop a longer-term plan to implement it, and I think all this was intended for originally. In fact, when it was first brought up, it was intended to be $1.5 million this year, $1.5 million next year, and $1.5 million following. Arbitrary numbers, but that concept of may have to phase things in just of our wherewithal to be able to implement it all.
Okay.
I was going to say there's this stalemate here. I'm not sure. Okay. On your assumption, on the next slide, you talk about the decrease. Your assumption or your direction seems logical in the sense that approve the position, and then if the matrix implementation plan calls for a decrease in that specific department, we can deal with reallocations or moving the puzzle pieces around. That seems logical to me, being close to the plan and realizing the two processes aren't on parallel paths. You're supposed to do feedback on that specific thought, so I wanted to give it.
Appreciate that, and if I may, another element, Larry raised the fact that there's a real desire to try to hire people sooner, thus have an impact on performance measures, have an impact on delivery of service. The traditional model in many, many organizations is that you get approval in July for your budget, and typically most of your bodies are hired by March of the following year, and you have created this grandiose plan that you're going to be able to deliver all these services and products. The thing that we did a year and a half ago was we said, look, why can't we expedite that process and get staff to start the recruitment schedule, the recruitment process, so that many of those positions could actually start being interviewed in July, August, September for hiring by December. I've asked staff to look at even being more aggressive than that, where many of the people are being hired in August and September as opposed to December. So some of our assumptions here are going to be impacted on by what matrix proposal brings forward. So some of the very positions that might be in this decreased bucket may very well be in a set aside or a hold pattern until we've actually gone through that research to look at the full analysis of that. But I think it's still doable that many of the positions, you already know what you want. You need to make sure you've got the job announcement ready. Now it's a matter of triggering the job announcement as soon as you have the word go. As opposed to, you got the word go, and now let's go and spend 30 days putting together the recruitment package. What we're trying to do is advance that cycle so that we would have more people in place sooner to actually perform the work that is being expected through the budget process and to accomplish the performance measures that are being suggested even in matrix and through the budget and everything else we've been doing.
Okay, that sounds reasonable.
Of course, in the police department, when you hire somebody, it's 8 months before you can actually use the personnel. Is that correct?
It can be 8, it can be 12 before they actually hit the street.
So that's...
And that may be 8 to 12 months just in the recruitment process, as both police and fire experience a long lead time. Then they have a 6 to 12 month training regiment that they have to go through before that individual is even available to augment the existing staff, one person per car arrangement, that kind of thing.
I don't want to interrupt him. Is he done?
I don't know.
Are you? Are you done?
Do you have one more point on the cotton?
Yeah, just let me follow up in the Cotton Lane Bridge funding specifically. As we went through that last week at the council meeting, I was asked to show you specifically how is this reflected in the budget. Okay, the $17 million for this year I showed you was taken out of our estimates for where we're going to start the year. And that was done earlier before we had the Newland agreement in place. And as we've said on this, our posture in finance and budget has always been until we see the cash, we're not including it. Well, that agreement's in place now. So we put the $14 million as a revenue in the 2007-2008 budget, even though we'll really get the cash sooner. It was easier to put it in next year's than it was to change that number mechanically. But we also, in our capital improvement plan funding for this upcoming year, we have $27 million earmarked for the Cotton Lane Bridge for expenditures. And that was just follow-up. Does that answer that question adequately for you? As indicated, this is really for you to get you the information. Georgia, if you want to.
Yeah, I just, we were given a briefing this past month on gains and how they're affecting our city and how they may affect our city in the future. And it concerned me a great deal. And it concerns me a great deal with all the new development we have opening up the next 12 months to 24. And it does take so long to train officers, to bring them on board. And I realize, looking at the budget, you've got 8 officers, 2 detectives, and 2 lieutenants. But I do know they went in for 12 officers, 4 detectives, and 2 lieutenants. And I'm really, really concerned about that department and about the future safety of the people of Goodyear. And I just feel like this might be the time that we need to expend on adding more police to our force. Does anybody else have any feelings on that?
Well, if I may, Mr. Mayor, this has always been a department that has been a concern for me, and I've always fought for additional personnel in the police department, and of course in the fire department as well, because these are so important services that protect this community.
Tell us what, most crimes are on property crimes. Is that, property, isn't that, I don't have, the chief's not here, but John?
But John is here.
John, you'll have to.
All right, here he is.
Hey,
Let's
say.
talk to us, because most,
It's like a surprise guest to the birthday party. He just pops out of nowhere.
tell us about, what comes under property crimes, and tell us about, you have only 1 officer or detective, is it, under the gang, taking care of that part?
Mayor Kavanaugh, Councilmember Lord, property crime basically is anything that is deals with anything of value.
Okay.
It could be defacing property, like graffiti, tagging. Could be theft, theft of any kind of material of value. It could be burglary, where someone's breaking into a structure, stealing something. It could be auto theft. We basically, and when we're working property crime, we have to evaluate and weigh the priority of property crime versus crimes against person. So currently our 6 detectives, when property crimes are present, we have to look and see what crimes against persons can we not work in order to do those. So largely what's happening is we have no devoted resource to the property crime. Those are largely worked by our patrol officers.
And so actually, that's a resource for our gang members. Property crime is a
Correct.
financial resource.
Correct.
So that's how they build their
Correct.
financial empire in order to continue their activities.
That's correct. They do those things in furtherance of their goals and objectives as a gang member or as a crime unit.
I guess what alarms me is you say we have to make some choices here, so we decide we're going to go ahead and let that happen while we take care of this. And
Crimes against persons is typically more serious type crime, and I think that certainly we need to look at that as a human victim versus someone who's lost some property, and oftentimes that property may or may not have been properly secured or those type of things. So, we have to look at what that really is. But certainly by far, our property crime is our, burglaries is our number one.
And I'm putting you on the spot, but how do you feel personally about the amount of officers that we're going to give you at this time with all the new development coming on in Goodyear?
Well, quite honestly, I think that it's a start. We need to look at our hiring practices. What can we reasonably hire in a year? How many positions at an academy can we get and train them, understanding that it takes about 9 months from when an officer is hired, put through the academy, and then completes field training, and that's if everything goes well. So, you're talking if officers were hired in July, we're looking at probably April before they're on the road as a solo officer. So it takes quite a while to do that.
How many can you hire at the same time? I mean, how many can you train at the same time?
Well, we could probably train about 8 or 9 officers at one time in the different phases. Where our difficulty would be is if these are officers that we're hiring that are not certified police officers and they have to go to the academy. We'd have to look at the 2 academies that we use here in the Valley, the Phoenix Academy or the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office Academy, and look at slots and when they can start. So they probably, most likely, would not all start at the same time. Say we did have a position for all 8, and we're able to hire them at once. We probably couldn't accommodate them in one academy class.
So you get too large a number, it actually goes into the next year's budget anyway.
Well, potentially it could. If we hired certified police officers, say someone from another agency wanted to come here, then you can put them right into training. That has been very good for us. Or hiring someone from out of state who is certified, and then they can take a waiver test rather than go to an academy. That has been very successful for us as well.
What percentage do you have that do that? That make it as experienced officers that come in?
Probably about 40% of the people we hire are already certified police officers.
So then you could take 12 officers in 1 year.
Reasonably, we could, yes. That would be a big year for us.
Would that be a year where you could say you actually might be catching up with what you need to be caught up on?
Again, with the delay, it's hard to say. If we needed those positions today as contributing solo officers, yeah, we could say it if we had them today. But in 9 months, we anticipate increases annually. So it may not be as big a boon to us in 9 months as it would be if we had those all here today. So.
And if they decided not to do more than 8 officers, your original number's 12 officers, 4 detectives, 2 lieutenants. Out of those numbers, which one would be more important to your department?
Well, Mayor Kavanaugh, Councilmember Lord, they're all important, and they're important from the standpoint of they all have to help out with the investigation and mitigation and elimination of crime. The patrol officers, we would hope that they, just by mere presence and the increase in their presence, would deter people from wanting to do crime. So we know we won't necessarily stop crime completely, but certainly we could displace it or dissuade people from wanting to do crime at that particular time. What becomes important is when crime does occur, we need to be very responsive to it and get a detective on there immediately, because that immediacy of the investigation oftentimes is what results in an arrest and the recovery of people's property. So to say one is more important than another, it's like a team. You can't run a football team without a quarterback or a key position. So really what they're key positions that assist each other doing their respective jobs.
Thank you.
Mayor.
Yes, sir.
Follow along, Chief. Do we use reserve officers?
Mayor Kavanaugh, Councilmember Antoniak, we do have a reserve program.
Right.
Currently, we have 1 reserve police officer, and largely is because we use it as a hiring pool. It's been an extremely good tool for us to hire our own people, and we are having a very difficult time of finding people who want to do this job for free. So.
What about people that want to do this job that don't? I mean, have we ever looked at doing a reserve pool, but paying them, such that maybe we grant you 2 FTEs, but that gets you, and we do supplemental type work where we get twice the amount of officers through an academy this year, but as funds become available, we then have people in reserve ready to go that maybe are working, 8 people working the equivalent of 2 full-time officers over the year. We are looking at
Mayor
things like
Kavanaugh,
that.
Councilmember Antoniak, that's a pretty progressive idea. We have not currently done that. Now, what we do have is we have a paid part-time police officer that's paid 20 hours a week, and we could kind of put that person where we need to, and that's worked out reasonably well for us.
But oftentimes the challenge is the balance between our desire to have crime prevention on the street and your desire to have qualified officers have lag time in between.
Certainly.
And so, I don't know, I'm sitting here listening to the conversation, I'm
Well, if
thinking
you
out loud.
increase, but if you increase it, it doesn't say they're going to come on in this next year.
No, but I'm thinking
And
if we increase the funds available such that, as Chief was just mentioning, you have a challenge in that reserves don't want to work for free. But if I'm a young guy or young gal that wants to be in the police force, and I may or may not, although they probably aren't having a hard time finding a job if they're well qualified.
Correct.
So it's not as if it's,
Yeah, a lot
may
of
or
that,
may not solve the problem that way.
a lot of that is market-driven right
Talent
now.
pool. Yeah.
15 years ago, that's why we had so many reserve officers. It was a way to get their foot in the door to get into being a police officer. Now we don't have that challenge, and with everybody hiring the way they're doing and being in this market area of the Phoenix metro area, they're very marketable, people are, especially if they're certified. You can now shop that certification around and go after these departments that are paying bonuses and longevity pay, or bringing you in with seniority, bringing you in at higher than entry level. I mean, there's a lot of competition out there for those same bodies. So,
Still have your high school program, your student program?
yes, sir. We do the school resource officer program. We do.
Good.
What about the Explorers?
Yes, we do have an Explorer post with about 14 Explorers. And those are young people between the ages of 14 and 20.
So I guess I don't have consensus about adding any additional police.
Well, but I asked,
I didn't hear anybody on the other side.
I asked the chief, whether or not, when I saw the figures, whether he's satisfied with that. He says, yes, I am. So. Am I correct in
Is
that?
that just the status quo and what you have to answer, or is that really?
That's tough to put
I
in
mean,
that.
I know. I'm sorry. Don't stand up
That's
yet.
not fair to the city
I'm
manager or the
sorry.
police.
I apologize.
I'll be willing to respond in this context, as the chief brought forward the issue of street crimes and the problems and the recognition. That's what led to the conversation about a gang resistance, a very aggressive program. And thank you, Mayor, for putting that item out there in the public arena. Let's get tough about it. I think a piece of this is, if you as a group have some interest in us going back and looking a little deeper in that to see if there are some additional resources we can marshal, then that's part of what we're doing here. That's also connected back almost in a way indirectly to the public safety as a portion of the $2.4 million pot. But, whether you want us to target that area, or if you want us to even consider some additional funds outside of that, that's because those will be challenging each other, competing for the same revenue source.
Public Safety Committee was
I'm sorry,
put together for that. Part of that's part of the reason.
Right.
Okay, Larry, you have some?
Well, I think it would be appropriate to say try and squeeze blood out of a turnip here. I think this is, from our discussions, again, without going too deep into the reports you're all reading, you're going to read that it suggests such. So,
I don't understand what you're asking.
well, in terms of men and women on the street, in terms of police officers.
It's a 3 to 40.
Yeah,
So
there was a
3 to 40 is what we
pretty
need.
significant recommendation. So,
That's the chief's job, though.
Right.
So,
Well, let us look at it under the umbrella of the matrix and some of this other additional information over the next couple of weeks and bring a proposal back to you.
Thanks.
That's good.
Thanks.
I guess, as I indicated up front, the goals of this session were to provide you with the information you need as we're going through. I've completed the presentation. You've got a lot of data. You may not have enough, so what I throw back to you is a question of what additional information would you like from us? I've already made notes on a couple of items that we discussed earlier.
On the supplementals,
Yes.
under street maintenance, there's a pavement management program. Is that what we talked about in last week's? Didn't we have an item on the agenda last week as it related to that?
I believe I read
Is that
something.
a technology program? When I read pavement management program, is that technology that we're spending $350,000 on?
Jim?
And have we already voted to do that?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Antoniak, to clarify what you voted on last week, if I recall what you're thinking of, it was pavement preservation projects, slurry sealing, things of that nature. Is that what you're
Yeah, I thought there was some technology thing in there too, though. Okay.
But this, what you're talking about now, the pavement management, is different than that. That is an actual program to evaluate the city's pavement and rate it, evaluate it, and then determine a prioritization for future repairs.
There's software programs attached to that.
Is this like a full assessment of what's going on? I'm trying to figure out how we get
Yes.
to $350,000
Yes.
just through software.
Full
Okay.
assessment.
So this is men, women on the street assessing where the cracks are, inventorying everything, every square inch of
It's-
pavement in the city.
As I recall, I believe it is a software program, and it's the actual use of that.
Proposing schedules for
People
when
rating by going
repairs
out on the
would be
street.
done on an annual basis.
Okay. And I have to ask this because I saw it in here. Somewhere there was a BlackBerry phone for $1,185. I assume that's the annual service included with that? Is
I
that-
would expect that that's the service
Okay.
included.
It's not my BlackBerry. Well, might be equivalent to my BlackBerry. Can I have one? Ask that guy.
Dr. Jesse?
What other information would the city council like to see as we go forward?
Let's start over here. Other questions or comments?
Very well done and very clear, and I'm very satisfied with the answer to my questions.
Great. On this side?
Okay. The thing that I was
Thank
concerned
you.
about is that we identified, what the developer is going to take care of down Sonora. And if we're going to do what you say we're going to do, I'm happy with that.
Okay. Is that it, Larry?
That is it. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we're meeting again Wednesday. Is that
I
correct?
won't be here.
I won't be here, sir.
So,
Yeah, 2 absence. Myself.
okay.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, you do have in front of you an agenda for Wednesday night. The intent of that is to receive an update regarding spring training project related to legal agreements coming forward for consideration, including Wood Corporate Campus Development Agreement, the Planned Area Development, the Infrastructure Agreement, the Land Conveyance, Cleveland Indian Use Agreement. Each of these, if I understand, Brian, are scheduled for the 14th for council action. So there's a lot of information that we wanted to bring forward to you before, give you a chance to digest it, give you a chance to meet with staff on those issues beforehand. If I might add, staff sent me an email this afternoon that I'd like to report on, which is the fact that we rolled out the Perryville Prison Work Release Program, and that we now have people actually doing landscape maintenance for us at a very reasonable fee of 50 cents an hour. So we'll keep
they
you
working on
apprised
Litchfield
on
Road?
that. I'm sorry?
Were they working on Litchfield Road today?
My understanding was Indian School Road, Saraville to Pebble Creek, was it? 2 crews, 4 female inmates each, with parks worker 3s, trimming median and cleaning the medians. Indian School Road from Falcon Drive to Cerebral Road this week, working a mile and a half apart from each other. So they work basically from 6 a.m. till noon.
I was gonna, since we're gonna be missing 2 of our members Wednesday, you're gonna need to be briefed before the 14th. Could we just have maybe 3 meetings of 3 people or fewer over the next week or 2? Half hour, very informal in 2:12 or something?
Would be much better.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council.
You'll give it on the 14th.
Well, I'd like to, the public would like to attend these briefings. There's meetings scheduled, and I think we should have it.
Well, can I have my question answered, if you don't mind? Thank you, Mr. Gelser.
The answer is since we have 5 different agreements that are part of this, and we're balancing them all on the head of a pin, I like to say, is that we would like an opportunity to have those that are focused on those agreements present to council. Challenge is one of trying to get all them here at one time. We have 3 different attorneys from Gus Rosenfeld. We are looking at, so we're trying to coordinate their calendars. Also, JMI Sports, Eric Judson will be available this Wednesday. Rose Properties will be available this Wednesday. They're not next week. They're going to be out of the office. So it was really trying to pull the most folks we could get together at one time. If that doesn't work, we can back off of that, though, certainly.
You're going to have to brief these 2 gentlemen for sure.
Excuse me. I'm looking here at May 2nd. I will be here. I beg your pardon. Yeah, I'm not leaving until 4.
Oh, good, so it's just.
Yeah,
All right.
I will go.
It's on
Shall we
the
proceed? Councilmember Holland will go ahead, or?
Yeah, that's all.
I think we should.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have plenty of these short notice things. None of us appreciate them, frankly. I agree with you.
Well, my 2 cents was we did it tonight, but obviously we're past that now.
Well, I can agree with you
Yeah,
on that.
I know both of us
Nice that
communicated that.
everything could go in one night.
It is what it is.
Okay, well, we'll have 6 here. So, but of course, we're going to be listening to your presentation, right?
Mr. Mayor, yes, it'll be presentation from staff. We will have a developer here that can talk about the project as well, but they will likely be presenting as it relates to the planned area development, the zoning part of it, as questions come up. But most of the presentations will be done by staff or our consultants.
Are you making progress?
Yes. 8 hours worth today, and we still continue.
You're going to be ready to on Wednesday with agreements?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we are going to be very close. We will have the business points. Certainly we'll talk about. We finalized really a couple of agreements today, zoning. We're just about there as well. So in all cases, we have enough information to bring before council in all those agreements and contracts.
Okay, further comments from council, questions of staff? City manager, any reports?
That's all, sir.
Do we want to introduce
Yes.
Shelley Vasquez?
Would you like to make an introduction?
Mayor and Council, I'd like to introduce your new assistant, Shelley Vasquez, and introduce you to the rest of the city. Shelley Vasquez comes from the city of Phoenix, where she worked for 18 years. She has spent the past 3 years working for Mayor Gordon, and we are very lucky to have her. She's already had a very busy day out and about. So please welcome Shelley.
Welcome aboard and enjoyed the day with you today, and looking forward to many more. Council will do the same, I'm sure. Meeting's adjourned.
Lloyd?
Lloyd?